You are looking at the most dangerous weapon of the 14th century, the mounted French knight. An 800-pound warhorse, a man encased in articulated steel, wielding a lance that could punch through a castle wall. They were the tanks of their age, the untouchable elite. And on this day, July 11, 1302, they faced an army of weavers, men who spent their days at a loom, men who worked with cloth and thread. The French commander, Robert of Artois, looked across the muddy field at the wall of commoners and reportedly scoffed, asking his squire to fetch him a needle and thread to sew them a shroud. The knights laughed. It was going to be a slaughter. They were right. It was a slaughter. But the bodies that would soon fill the ditches and choke the streams would not be the weavers. They would be their own. This battle wasn't born on a field, but in the dark cobblestone streets of a city. Bruges, the jewel of Flanders, a city fantastically wealthy from the cloth trade. But it was a city under occupation. The French king, Philip the Fair, had annexed Flanders, installing a governor named Jacques de Châtillon, who bled the city dry with crippling taxes. The proud guilds, the weavers, the butchers, the artisans, they were pushed to the breaking point. The breaking point came before dawn on May 18, 1302. In a coordinated citywide uprising known as the Bruges Matins, the Flemish rebels went from house to house where the French garrison was quartered. The password to identify a Frenchman was Schild and Friend, a phrase nearly impossible for a native French speaker to pronounce correctly. A wrong pronunciation was a death sentence. By sunrise, the French garrison was annihilated. King Philip had been handed the ultimate insult. An entire city of commoners had risen up and murdered his soldiers. This was not just a rebellion, it was an act of war. And the king's response would be biblical in its fury. If you ever wanted to see the sheer power of a medieval kingdom, you would look at the army King Philip assembled. This wasn't just a punitive force, it was the flower of French chivalry. 2,500 noble knights and men-at-arms, backed by 1,000 crossbowmen and nearly 5,000 infantry. At its heart was the nobility, men who had trained for war since they could walk. Their armor was a work of art, their bloodlines were impeccable, and their arrogance was boundless. Leading them was Robert II of Artois, a veteran commander, a brawler, a man who believed in one simple tactic, the overwhelming, unstoppable cavalry charge. To him, warfare was a science with one answer. Any problem, any enemy formation could be shattered by the pure kinetic force of armored lances. He looked at the Flemish rebels not as an army, but as a peasant mob, an inconvenience to be trampled into the mud on the way to retaking Bruges. While the French knights polished their gilded armor, the cities of Flanders were buzzing with a different kind of energy. The guilds took charge. These weren't feudal lords calling up peasants. These were professional organizations turning themselves into military units. The weavers, the largest and most powerful guild, formed the core of the army. They were joined by the butchers, the masons, the bakers, men who understood discipline, organization, and teamwork from their daily lives. Their leaders weren't nobles in the French sense. They were men like William of Jülich, a clergyman with a warrior's spirit, and Guy of Nemours, a minor noble who threw his lot in with the commoners. They knew they couldn't fight the French on their terms. They couldn't out-knight the knights, so they had to change the entire equation. They gathered an army of about 9,000 men, almost all infantry. They were poorly armored compared to the French, but they had two things the French severely underestimated: a home field advantage and a weapon designed for one purpose: killing knights.
This is the Goodendag.
Its name is a grim piece of Flemish irony, literally meaning "good day." It was anything but. The weapon was brutally simple, a thick wooden staff about 5 feet long that swelled at the top. From that wider end, a sharp iron spike protruded. It was a perfect hybrid weapon. You could use it like a club, swinging its heavy end to break bones or stun a horse, but its true genius was in the spike. The Flemish battle plan wasn't to fight a duel, it was to create a wall of these things. A charging knight on a horse is high off the ground. A man on foot with a Goodendag could brace the butt of the staff against the ground, aim the spike at the chest of the horse, and let the charge impale the animal. Once the knight was unhorsed, trapped in the mud and weighed down by his own armor, he was helpless. The Goodendag could then be used like a spear, thrusting through the weak points in the armor, the visor, the armpits, the groin. It was a crude, ugly peasant's weapon, and it was about to become a noble's nightmare. The Flemish army knew they couldn't win in an open field. A flat, dry plain was a cavalry playground, so they didn't offer one. They marched to the city of Kortrijk and laid siege, knowing the French army would have to come to them. And just outside the city walls, they found their perfect killing ground. It was a seemingly flat, open field, exactly the kind of terrain a knight would dream of for a charge. But it was deceptive. The field was crisscrossed by a network of streams and marshy brooks. The Flemish spent days preparing it. They deepened the ditches, widened the streams, and dug new pits, camouflaging them with turf and branches. They were transforming the battlefield from a cavalry run into a giant, muddy trap. They weren't just waiting for the French, they were setting a snare. They positioned themselves with the river lies at their back, deliberately cutting off their own retreat. It was a clear message to their own men and to the French. We win here or we die here. There is no running. The French army arrived on July 8th and saw exactly what the Flemish wanted them to see: a rabble of peasants hiding behind a few ditches. Robert of Artois was unimpressed. His scouts warned him about the marshy ground, but his arrogance blinded him. He dismissed the warnings. How could a bunch of weavers possibly stand against his knights? The French camp was a scene of supreme confidence. They feasted, drank, and gambled on how quickly the battle would be over. They were already planning their victory parade through Bruges. In the Flemish camp, the mood was starkly different. It was somber, resolved. The men confessed their sins. They knew the morning could be their last. A decree was passed through the ranks: no prisoners. The French nobility fought for ransom. A captured knight was worth a fortune. But the Flemish weren't fighting for money. They were fighting for their lives, their freedom, their city. They couldn't afford to take prisoners. Every Frenchman who fell had to be killed. It was a level of brutality the French aristocracy simply could not comprehend. The morning of July 11th broke hot and clear. The French army advanced, a glittering river of steel and bright banners. Their plan was simple and traditional. First, the infantry and crossbowmen would advance to soften up the enemy line. Then the cavalry would deliver the hammer blow. For a while, it went according to plan. The French infantry pushed the Flemish skirmishers back. The professional Genoese crossbowmen in French pay began a deadly duel with their Flemish counterparts. But Robert of Artois was impatient. He saw the Flemish line waver slightly, and his blood began to boil. He saw his moment of glory. He didn't want the infantry to win the battle for him. The glory of victory belonged to the knights, to his class. He made a fateful decision. He ordered his infantry to pull back, to clear the field for the cavalry. The foot soldiers were stunned, but they obeyed, retreating to the sides to open a path for the main event. And then came the sound. At first, a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then a tremor in the very earth itself. The French knights moved forward. 7 main cavalry divisions, a solid wall of men and horses, began to advance. They started at a walk, then a trot, then a canter, their discipline perfect. The noise grew into a deafening roar, the thunder of hooves, the jangle of armor, the war cries of thousands of men screaming for blood and glory. From the Flemish lines, it must have looked like the apocalypse. A tidal wave of steel was coming to erase them from the earth. This was the moment that had broken armies across Europe for centuries. This was the charge that was supposed to be unstoppable. The Flemish braced themselves, planting the butts of their Goodendags into the soft earth, creating a dense forest of iron spikes aimed directly at the heart of the storm. The first wave of knights hit the kill zone at full speed, and the world fell apart. The ground that looked so solid simply vanished beneath their horses' hooves. War horses, weighing half a ton, moving at 30 miles an hour, suddenly plunged into the deepened, muddy streams the Flemish had so carefully prepared. The sickening crunch of breaking bone echoed across the field. Horses screamed as their legs snapped. Knights, encased in 50 pounds of steel, were thrown from their saddles, becoming helpless projectiles. The unstoppable charge became an instant, catastrophic pileup. The knights behind them, blinded by the dust and the men in front, had no time to stop. They crashed into the fallen, creating a horrific tangle of dying horses, trapped men, and shattered lances. The beautiful, terrifying wave of chivalry had broken itself upon a series of cleverly disguised ditches. The French attack was gutted before it had even reached the Flemish line.
This was the moment the weavers and butchers had been waiting for. They didn't wait for the French to recover. They advanced. They surged forward from their defensive line and waded into the chaos. And now, the Goodendag proved its terrible worth. Knights who were still mounted were easy targets, their horses impaled on the braced spikes. Those who had fallen were even more helpless. A knight on his back in the mud was like an overturned turtle. He could barely move. The Flemish swarmed them. This wasn't the chivalrous combat the French understood. There were no duels. A single knight would be surrounded by half a dozen commoners. They used the club end of the Goodendag to bludgeon, to smash helmets and break limbs. They used the spike to find the gaps in the armor, to drive through visors and into throats. The battle devolved into a brutal, personal, and ugly slaughter. It was a butcher's work, and there were many butchers in the Flemish army.
Robert of Artois, watching from the rear, could not believe what he was seeing. His perfect army, the pride of France, was being dismantled in a muddy ditch by peasants. Consumed by rage and shame, he decided to save the day himself. He gathered his personal retainers and the remaining cavalry reserves for one last, desperate charge. He wasn't aiming for the flank, he was aiming for the heart of the Flemish line, where their main banner flew. He believed if he could cut down their standard and their leaders, the peasant army would break and flee. It was a textbook heroic move. With a roar of defiance, Robert of Artois plunged into the fray, his elite knights following him. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. His charge had weight and fury, and it punched deep into the Flemish formation. He got close, so close to the banner, but he too was now in the killing field, surrounded, his horse mired in the mud. Tradition states that Robert of Artois was unhorsed, but fought on bravely on foot. Surrounded, wounded, and recognizing defeat, he did what any nobleman would do. He tried to surrender. He threw down his sword and shouted his name, expecting to be taken for a rich ransom. But he was shouting at men who had sworn an oath to take no prisoners. They didn't know who he was, and they didn't care. To them, he was just another enemy knight. According to one account, a colossal lay brother and former butcher named Willem van Saftinga confronted the French commander. Artois pleaded for his life. In response, the butcher brought his Goodendag down, ending the life of the cousin of the King of France. The commander of the French army was dead, bludgeoned to death in a ditch like a common soldier. With his fall, The last hope of the French army died with him. The death of their commander shattered what little morale the French had left. The fight turned into a rout. Knights who could extricate themselves from the mud turned and fled, hacking their way through their own infantry who now blocked their escape. The discipline of the most feared army in Europe evaporated into pure panic. The Flemish did not let up. They pursued the fleeing French relentlessly, cutting them down as they ran. The French infantry, who had been so arrogantly pulled back by Artois, now paid the price. They were caught between the vengeful Flemish and their own panicking cavalry. They broke and ran without ever having been a major part of the fight. The field was left to the Flemings. The battle, which had been anticipated as a day-long affair, was over in a matter of hours. When the silence finally fell upon the field, the scale of the victory became clear. The ground was littered with the bodies of France's elite. Over 1,000 nobles and knights, including the commander-in-chief and much of his senior staff, lay dead. The Flemish walked the battlefield, not just to loot, but to collect a specific trophy. From the heels of the dead knights, they collected their gilded spurs, the very symbol of their knighthood. They gathered more than 500 pairs. These weren't melted down for gold. They were taken to the Church of Our Lady in Kortrijk and hung from the rafters as a monument to their impossible victory. It was a message to the world. The age of the untouchable knight was over. Common men with simple weapons and clever tactics could defeat them. The battle would forever be known not by the name of the field, but by the trophies left behind. The Battle of the Golden Spurs. The news of the defeat at Kortrijk sent a shockwave across the continent. It was simply unbelievable. An army of commoners had not just defeated, but annihilated a professional army of knights. For the first time, a major European power had been humbled by a peasant militia. Military theorists everywhere took note. The idea that a disciplined, well-equipped infantry force could defeat heavy cavalry was no longer a theory, it was a proven fact. The English, in their long wars with the Scots and later the French, would perfect this lesson with their longbowmen. The Swiss would do it with their pike squares. But the Flemish did it first, with a farmer's tool and a muddy field. The myth of the invincible knight, the bedrock of the medieval social and military order, had been shattered. But the story doesn't end here. King Philip the Fair was not a man to accept humiliation. The victory of the Golden Spurs secured Flemish independence for a short time, but it also guaranteed a furious French response. 2 years later, in 1304, Philip led another army into Flanders himself. At the Battle of Mons-en-Pévèle, the French fought the Flemish to a bloody draw, but Philip claimed victory. He eventually forced the Flemish to accept a harsh treaty, and part of the price was the return of the Golden Spurs. The trophies were taken down from the church and, most likely, destroyed. The Franco-Flemish War would drag on for years, a brutal and expensive conflict. The weavers of Bruges had won a battle, but they had not won the war. Not yet. Their act of defiance had plunged the region into decades of further conflict.
Ultimately, the Battle of the Golden Spurs is a story of hubris. The French army was, on paper, superior in every way. They had better training, better equipment, and more experience. They lost for one simple reason: they despised their enemy. They couldn't imagine that weavers and butchers could be a legitimate military threat. Robert of Artois didn't lose because his knights weren't brave. He lost because he was arrogant. He refused to listen to intelligence. He refused to adapt his tactics. He believed so completely in the superiority of his own class that he led them into a perfectly obvious trap. He saw the ditches, he was warned about the mud, but his pride would not allow him to believe that commoners could outthink him. It's a timeless lesson in warfare. Never underestimate your opponent.
The moment you stop respecting the person trying to kill you is the moment you've already lost. In modern Belgium, the Battle of the Golden Spurs holds a powerful, almost mythical status. It is seen as the birth of the Flemish identity, a David versus Goliath story where the common man stood up to a powerful, arrogant foreign oppressor. July 11th is now celebrated as the official holiday of the Flemish community. The battle has been romanticized in books, paintings, and poems for centuries, becoming a cornerstone of Flemish nationalism. Of course, the reality was more complex. It was less about national identity, which didn't really exist in the 14th century, and more about urban economic freedom versus feudal monarchy. But myths are powerful. The story of the weavers who defeated the knights continues to resonate because it speaks to a universal theme, the fight of the underdog against the seemingly invincible. The military legacy of 1302 is profound. While the French aristocracy tried to forget this humiliation, other military leaders studied it intently. The core principle that disciplined infantry with the right weapons and terrain could break a cavalry charge became the foundation for the next century of warfare. The English longbowmen at Crécy and Agincourt, who slaughtered French knights from a distance, were applying the same lesson: don't fight the knights on their terms. The Swiss pikemen, who created impenetrable mobile fortresses of pikes, perfected the close quarters version of this idea. Kortrijk was the proof of concept. It demonstrated that the age of cavalry dominance was coming to an end. The future of the battlefield belonged to the common foot soldier, fighting as a disciplined, cohesive unit.
There is a tragic footnote to the French defeat, and it lies with their own infantry. Robert of Artois had thousands of good foot soldiers and crossbowmen at his disposal. A combined arms approach, using his infantry to pin the Flemish while his cavalry maneuvered, might have won the day. But his aristocratic disdain for the common soldier was his undoing. He saw them not as a valuable part of his army, but as an obstacle in the way of his glorious charge. By ordering them to pull back, he not only wasted their potential, but also put them in a terrible position. When the cavalry broke and fled, it was the infantry who were caught in the stampede, trampled by their own side, before being cut down by the advancing Flemish. Their fate is a stark reminder that the arrogance of the French command cost not only the lives of nobles, but of the common men they so readily despised.
It's easy to say the Goodendag won the battle, but that's only half the story. The weapon was effective only because of the men who wielded it and the ground they chose. The French knights had lances, swords, and armor, technologically superior in every way. But their entire military doctrine was built on an assumption of individual heroism and the shock of the charge. The Flemish doctrine was built on something new: collective defense, terrain denial, and ruthless efficiency. They fought as a single block, a machine made of men. The Goodendag wasn't a dueling weapon, it was a component in that machine. It represents a shift in thinking, from warfare as a contest of champions to warfare as a grim, calculated science. The will to stand together in a shield wall was more powerful than the finest steel sword. The Battle of the Golden Spurs was more than just a battle. It was a social revolution fought in a muddy field. It was the moment when the rigid feudal hierarchy was dealt a staggering blow. For centuries, the order of society was clear. The nobles fought, the clergy prayed, and the commoners worked. On July 11, 1302, the commoners proved they could fight too, and not just fight, but win, against the very symbols of the feudal order. They showed that organization, preparation, and determination could overcome birthright and breeding. The world was changing. The growing power of cities, of trade, of organized labor had finally manifested on the battlefield. The weavers who left their looms to stand against the most feared knights in Europe didn't just win a battle, they helped weave the fabric of a new world. So the next time you hear a story of an underdog victory, think of the weavers of Bruges. Think of an army of elites so confident in their own power that they charged headlong into a trap they were warned about. They believed their steel, their horses, and their noble blood made them invincible. They learned in the most brutal way possible that no one is invincible. They learned that a common man, standing on his own ground, fighting for his home, is the most dangerous opponent of all. The Golden Spurs hung in that church as a testament not just to a military victory, but to the fatal cost of underestimation. What do you think is the most overlooked factor in this incredible battle? Was it the weapon, the terrain, or the arrogance of the French? Let me know in the comments below.